good evening, early afternoon, depending on where you're tuning in from. My name is Sydney Yeager, and I am the Senior Public Programs Producer at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I'm so pleased to welcome you to today's discussion of Jewish Sunday schools. Here at the museum, we are dedicated to the crucial mission of educating our diverse community about Jewish life and heritage before, during, and after the Holocaust. As part of that mission, our programs illuminate the stories of survivors, broader histories of hate and anti-Semitism, stories of resistance against injustice, and more. Thank you so much for joining us today virtually. We hope that if you are able to, that you will visit the museum in person to see our current exhibitions, including Courage to Act, Rescue in Denmark, the museum's first exhibition for visitors ages 9 and up. We also hope that you will check out the museum's new Calico Center for Jewish genealogy, which you can find out more about on our website. Closed captions are available on today's program. Instructions on how to turn captions on or off are posted in the chat. And so you can check out that link as well. If you have questions for our speaker during the program, please put them in the Zoom Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the hour. So not the chat, but the Q&A. Today, we are so honored to be joined by Laura Yares, who is Assistant Professor in the Department of Religious Studies at Michigan State University. And you can buy Jewish Sunday schools at the link in the chat. So thank you so much for joining us. And now I'm going to hand things over to Laura.
Thank you so much, Sydney, and thank you to everybody for being here today and for inviting me to talk to you a little bit about my new book, Jewish Sunday Schools Teaching Religion in 19th Century America. Now, the first question that I'm often asked when I talk to people about this book is how I got interested in the topic. Because as you can probably guess from my accent, which is the first thing that people usually notice about me, I'm not American myself, at least not originally. I'm now a citizen after living here for many years, but I wasn't born in the US. I was born in England. I'm not from the 19th century either, as it happens, but I am Jewish, and I'm a teacher, and I'm a professor of Jewish studies, and I'm also female. And the story of 19th century American Jewish education is very much a story about Jewish women who began to play public roles as leaders and as teachers. A story about women who broke new ground and who put forward new ideas about what women were capable of and what they could do. Jewish women really took over the industry of Jewish education in 19th century America. But their legacy has mostly been judged quite harshly by historians of American Judaism. So tracing the work of these women and clarifying the record about what they did and the conditions under which they did it, well, that quickly became a project that I began to feel very personally invested in as a woman working in higher education. So in my talk today, I'm going to focus particularly on sharing with you how the story of 19th century American Jewish Sunday schools is really a story about American Jewish women. And it's really an honor to come and share the stories of those women with you. So I am going to share a few slides with you. So hopefully you can see some pictures on the screen. Now, the women who took over Jewish education in 19th century America were doing something quite radical. And to understand what was so radical about it, it's maybe helpful to situate their work in some broader historical context. So, of course, traditionally, Jewish education was really a male-dominated affair. In the Jewish communities of Europe, for example, a child might go to cheder, to an elementary school, Jewish elementary school, at age 5, where he might study the Hebrew Bible, often with the commentary of Rashi, a 12th century French rabbi, later adding the study of Mishnah. If a boy came from a family with financial means or was considered particularly talented, he might progress on to study Talmud in a yeshiva, in an institution of higher Jewish learning. And especially talented male students might study in yeshiva well into adulthood as an occupation of sorts. And of course, the idea that the study of the Talmud could be a full-time pursuit really reflects the classical Jewish presupposition that study represents a spiritual occupation in its own right. Now, this was a world from which women were historically largely excluded. Only in some contexts would girls attend cheder, Jewish elementary schools, and they certainly didn't study in yeshiva. So Barbara Streisand in the movie Yentl is very much the exception that proves the rule here. Now, for many girls, their Jewish religious education probably stopped at the Bible and basic prayers. Their primary teachers were mothers and female relatives, and their curriculum would have focused particularly on domestic Judaism, how to keep a kosher kitchen, personal prayers, and biblical stories. Girls might learn some Hebrew for the purposes of reading the Bible and the Siddur, the Jewish prayer book, but typically, at least for European Jewish girls, religious learning was often conducted in Yiddish, which was, of course, the spoken language of so many European Jews. And we know this because prayer books that were written specifically for European Jewish women were often written in Yiddish, so the vernacular, rather than the holy tongue. So traditional Jewish education then was very much a gendered domain. Women played really important roles in the home as teachers of girls and young children. They taught the stories of the Hebrew Bible, the most introductory text of the Jewish canon, and they also taught basic prayers and domestic obligations. But public Jewish educational institutions were mostly male-dominated spaces. Boys went to school to learn Bible with Rashi's commentary and then later Mishnah and Talmud from male educators. So historically, formal study of the Torah and familiarity with the Jewish textual tradition functioned as an important marker of Jewish male identity, while correspondingly exclusion from the study house was a marker of Jewish womanhood. Now, Jews began to establish communities in America beginning in the 17th century. And at first, American Jewish education in these new communities largely followed these traditional precedents. So full-time Jewish day schools offered instruction in secular and Judaic subjects to children whose parents could afford to send them. Many were for boys, although there were some private schools for Jewish girls as well. Alternatively, wealthy parents might opt for a private tutor to come and teach children at home. And schools were often organized by congregations, and these were generally more affordable than the private schools. So many of these congregational schools were all-day institutions. Others offered afternoon instruction in the Hebrew language and in classical Jewish texts. And the educators who taught in these congregational schools were usually men who had received rabbinical or yeshiva education in Europe. Now, across the spectrum, these congregational and all-day Jewish schools were beset with some significant challenges. So classes were typically quite large and corporal punishment was often rife. So on the screen here are two images of the Rodef Shalom Synagogue in Philadelphia, which was founded in 1795. On the left is the congregation's first building, which it constructed in 1871, and on the right is the congregation's current synagogue today. Now, during the 19th century, Rodef Shalom maintained a congregational afternoon school, which children were expected to attend every weekday afternoon and also on Shabbat and on Sunday mornings as well. And try telling that to Hebrew school students today. Now, there were over 80 students that were enrolled in each of the school's two classes, and there was only one instructor shared between them. So needless to say, the school was pretty chaotic. When one teacher announced his resignation to the synagogue board, he complained that it was impossible to teach in the school because students spent the entire class session firing shooting crackers. And by the time that he would manage to restore order, he said it would be time for dismissal. Now, it wasn't only students who caused problems in these weekday schools. Many of the educators who served as teachers were itinerant chazanim, or cantors, who moved from place to place, and they didn't always take their responsibilities all that seriously. So at the Addis Israel congregation in Washington, D.C., which was founded in 1869, the weekday congregational Hebrew school failed when it was discovered that the Chazan, whose name was Joseph A. Cohen, that he was late to lessons. Sometimes he didn't even bother coming at all, and he was mistreating the children with physical punishments. So Cohen was persuaded to resign, and the school ceased operation for the next 2 years. Now, the challenges that these 19th century Jewish schools faced were financial as well as administrative. For many Jewish parents, particularly those who were new immigrants, the cost of Jewish education, even at the more affordable congregational afternoon schools, well, that extended far beyond their financial reach. And I think it's important to note that in the mid 19th century, the American Jewish community really saw an influx of new immigrants, largely from Western Europe. So prior to about 1820, there were only about 2 to 3,000 Jews who were mostly of Sephardi origin settled in America. But between 1820 to 1880, approximately 150 to 200,000 Ashkenazi Jewish migrants from Western and Central Europe arrived in the United States. Now, for these immigrants, scarce financial resources made joining congregations and obtaining access to religious education, well, that was very challenging for these immigrant families. Children often helped to support their families by engaging in paid employment or doing piecemeal work or providing childcare for younger siblings so that parents could go out to work during the week. So these children really had very few opportunities to attend all-day schools or even supplementary Jewish schools that were held every weekday afternoon. And of course, during this period, free public education was becoming increasingly available to children as well. So free public schools were expanding across the northeastern United States, beginning in the 1840s. And as a result, calls to Jewish parents to enroll their children in expensive all-day Jewish schools that was falling increasingly on deaf ears. The public schools, of course, offered affordable access to secular education and the opportunity to really proficiently learn the English language, which would facilitate children's future employment prospects and also seemed to signal to the non-Jewish majority that Jewish parents were committed to immersing their children in American culture. So it was in this context that the first American Jewish Sunday school opened its doors. And the woman who rang the opening bell is on the screen here. Her name was Rebecca Gratz. She was a pioneering American-born Sephardi Jewish woman who dedicated her life to her philanthropic work among Philadelphia's needy. Now, Gratz called her Sunday school the Hebrew Sunday School for the Instruction of Israelites. And she offered in her school a religious education that was really modeled on the Sunday schools that were attended by young Christian children. Now, Gratz was really concerned that Jewish children who were playing on the streets of Philadelphia on Sunday mornings were becoming really easy prey for enthusiastic missionaries who would lure new recruits to their Bible classes. So at her Sunday school, what she decided to offer to Jewish children was first and foremost a safe space to spend their Sunday mornings, and also a basic primer in Judaism that she hoped would equip them with sufficient Jewish knowledge to rebut the claim of predatory missionaries. So in her Sunday school, Gratz left aside the curriculum of traditional European Jewish education. And what she taught instead were introductory Jewish catechisms, English language prayers, and simple home rituals for celebrating the Jewish calendar. And there were a number of reasons why she departed from traditional precedents. First and foremost, teaching the Chumash, the Pentateuch in Hebrew, or the intense legal disputations of the Talmud, well, that was unrealistic for a school that met just for a few hours once a week. But also, Gratz and the other women who volunteered as teachers, well, they hadn't received training in these subjects themselves. So, put simply, these women taught their young charges what they had been taught as children. So, at the Philadelphia Hebrew Sunday School, Jewish children heard Rebecca Gratz read aloud from the weekly Torah portion in English. They learned basic rituals for celebrating Jewish holidays. They learned about characters from the Bible, and they talked about God and faith. And they also learned about Jewish approaches to morality and ethics and charity. So their education looked a lot like what contemporary Christian children would have learned in their Sunday schools. And indeed, this was very much intentional. The school met on Sunday mornings when Christians would be attending the schools of their own denominations. And in so doing, in organizing itself in this way, the Hebrew Sunday School was really trying to impress upon young American Jews that their tradition was very much equal to that was being taught to the Presbyterians and the Methodists and the Baptists who might have been meeting down the street. Now, Rebecca Gratz and the women who volunteered with her in the Philadelphia Hebrew Sunday School admittedly brought little expertise in Jewish subjects to their work in the classroom. But these women saw benevolent service to the cause of Jewish education as a project that was very appropriate for women, and also as a project that was an important intervention in the future of their religious community. These were mostly wealthy, Sephardi, American-born Jewish women, and they had time to spend volunteering and contributing to charitable endeavors. And they saw Jewish education as an important charitable project. They certainly eliminated much that was canonical to the traditional curriculum of Jewish education, but the institutions in which that curriculum had traditionally been taught had been closed to them as children. Historically, they were limited to men and boys. So rather than Talmud, the Hebrew Sunday School foregrounded devotional study of the Bible, a text that was associated with women in both traditional frameworks of Jewish learning as well as in the Protestant cultural mores of 19th century America as well. Now, news of Gratz's initiative spread very quickly. Just a few months after Gratz opened her Philadelphia school, a woman by the name of Sally Lopez of Reformed Congregation Beth Elohim in Charleston, South Carolina, she created a Sunday school for the children of her community. And reportedly, Lopez exactly replicated Gratz's lessons, which Gratz would write out for her and send by Charleston to mail each week. Another school was created later that year. It was called the Association for the Moral and Religious Instruction of Children of the Jewish Faith, and it was created by the women of New York congregation Shereth Israel. Some of you might be familiar with it, and that was a traditional Spanish and Portuguese synagogue. And it offered classes for poor Jewish children each Sunday, regardless of their synagogue membership. And the women who created it were inspired, they said, by the, quote, ladies of the Jewish persuasion of Philadelphia. The school was led by a female superintendent, and in its first year, 20 women volunteered as teachers. In 1839, 1 year later, a fourth Sunday school was founded in Richmond, Virginia, under the auspices of the Ladies' Auxiliary of Beth Shalom, which was another Orthodox congregation. And that school was led also by a local Jewish woman, and her name was Emma Mordecai. Now, what you may have noticed here from this brief description of the first Jewish Sunday schools created in the United States was that right at the outset, Jewish Sunday schools were created by communities across the denominational spectrum of American Judaism. They were founded by communities that we would describe today as Orthodox or traditional, and not only by synagogues that identified with the Reform movement. So today, while we might think of Sunday school as a Jewish educational option that's primarily associated with more liberal Jewish denominations, in the 19th century, they were founded by Orthodox communities and not only by Reform ones. And there's a very good reason for this. Sunday schools were embraced by Jewish communities across the denominational spectrum because they were very evidently pragmatic and affordable for an American Jewish community that was largely comprised of new immigrants who were struggling to get a hold on life in America. Sunday schools required little commitment from students or from volunteer teachers, and so they seemed to offer a realistic model for Jewish education. Now, to understand this, I think it's helpful to remember that America offered unprecedented latitude to its Jewish community. So, congregational autonomy and the absence of recognized sources of communal authority, well, that made Jewish affiliations largely voluntary for new immigrants in the 19th century. Most 19th century American Jews were mobile rather than settled. And so most didn't join synagogues, and they were unlikely to enroll their children in expensive Jewish all day or every afternoon schools. So Sunday schools, quite frankly, were an expedient and practical solution to the problem of providing a basic Jewish education to a Jewish community that wasn't tied to Jewish institutions. So, using Gratz's initiative as a model, over the course of the 19th century, Jewish Sunday schools were founded in Jewish communities across the United States, across Canada, and the Caribbean. At the beginning, they were overwhelmingly organized by female superintendents and they were served by female teachers. So, Sunday schools offered really important opportunities for communal leadership to women who were largely prohibited from other public facing roles in the synagogue at the time, such as the ability to become a rabbi or read from the Torah or lead services. So, what did male rabbis and community leaders make of all of this? Well, some celebrated this female led Jewish Sunday school initiative. They deemed it a productive use of time and energy for affluent Jewish society women. And in broader American Protestant culture, of course, religious education was considered women's work. It was an activity that women were believed to be naturally inclined. And so Jewish Sunday schools provided opportunities for Jewish women to play public roles in their religious communities that matched those played by Protestant women. So they made an implicit claim for the equality of Judaism and the equality of Jewish women with their Christian counterparts. And that seemed like a very good thing for a tiny minority community. For other contemporary observers, however, placing women in an occupation that was traditionally restricted to males and reimagining the curriculum of Jewish learning to focus on topics that had long been understood to be associated with a domestic women's domain, Bible, simple prayers, well, that was seen as nothing short of a betrayal of Judaism itself. So critics, male critics of the Sunday school movement, they denounced these once-a-week Jewish Sunday schools as offering nothing more than saccharine female spirituality, a pale imitation of popular Christian motifs in a vaguely Jewish key. Let's look at Baltimore, for example, and at the work of Sarah Nunes Carvalho. She's here on the screen. She was another wealthy Sephardic woman, and one of the challenges of sharing images with you of this period, of course, is that we have very few images of Jewish women, and some of the images that we do have are mostly of women who were wealthy, and so you're going to see a lot of images of men in that I'm going to share with you today. But where possible, I do try and source images of women. And Sarah Carvalho was wealthy, and so her husband actually painted this portrait of her. Now, in Baltimore, where she lived, Sarah Nunes Carvalho, she rallied a group of 17 women to found the Baltimore Hebrew Sunday School Society in 1857, and she very much replicated the model that was developed by Rebecca Gratz. Within a year, the school had enrolled over 30 students, and that led a correspondent to a Philadelphia Jewish newspaper. That newspaper was called The Occident. That correspondent wrote that the growth of Sarah's school was unparalleled by any Jewish school in America. Yet her work was ridiculed by local rabbis. This is a local Reform rabbi on the screen here. His name was David Einhorn. And he said that because Carvalho and her team possessed little in the way of Jewish or Hebrew knowledge, he told parents that they should not send their children to the school because if they did so, the children would be crippled by weibliche Theologie or women's theology. Another local Baltimore rabbi, an Orthodox rabbi by the name of Benjamin Zold, he also denounced Carvalho's work. Now, Benjamin Zold, his last name might be familiar to you. He was the father of Henrietta Zold, the founder of Hadassah. But perhaps despite his daughter, he wasn't a big fan of women taking over the education of children. And what he said in response to Carvalho's school was, there is no better way to make a mockery of religion than to depend upon volunteers to carry out the religious instruction of the children. So what you see from these two examples was that opposition to Jewish Sunday schools spanned the emerging denominational spectrum of 19th century American Judaism. Benjamin Zold was Orthodox, but David Einhorn was Reform, and Sunday schools were criticized by other Reform rabbis as well. Perhaps the most important among them was Isaac Mayer Wise, who would become the de facto head of the American Jewish Reform movement in the 19th century. Now, in the end, he ended up coming around to Jewish Sunday schools, but at first he did not mince words in his criticism of these institutions. So shortly after arriving in the United States in 1847, he wrote a letter back home to Germany to the Allgemeine Zeitung des Judentums newspaper in Leipzig. And in that letter, he described the fine progress of American Judaism in all matters, he said, with the exception of Jewish education. And here's what he wrote. Only some communities like his own, the Chazan teaches Hebrew reading and has the children read a little in various catechisms, and frequently the miracle occurs that a boy learns to render the Neginah, the chant for reading Torah, and a few chapters of Chumash, the Torah, into German. In other congregations, he besmirched, they have introduced a phantom affair called a Sunday school. There, religious instruction for children is imparted each Sabbath or Sunday by good-hearted young women. Yet what fruits these few hours can bring forth hardly necessitates further description. And he closes his letter by promising that, quote, this snake of insufficient education will soon have its head crushed. So Einhorn, Zold, and Wise's dismissal of the women who taught in Jewish Sunday schools was certainly a criticism of what they saw as the limited curriculum that these schools offered. And it was a criticism of the lack of Jewish knowledge of the women who volunteered as teachers. But their condescension towards the Jewish Sunday school movement was also motivated in no small part by the perception that these schools posed a threat towards more intensive Jewish educational initiatives, like the schools at their own congregations, and that they also posed a threat to the livelihoods of male educators. So in America, as in Europe, teaching offered a means for Jewishly educated males to make a living and support themselves financially. And indeed, Wise himself depended on teaching for his salary. So in the first congregation that he served, which was Beth Al in Albany in New York, there wasn't enough work there to make up a full-time job as a congregational rabbi. So Wise taught the community's children each weekday from 9 till 4 p.m., and he taught them both secular and Judaic subjects, and that was in addition to his pulpit responsibilities. So for people like Wise, Gratz's initiative, quite simply, well, it threatened his ability to make a living. But ultimately, the writing was on the wall because Jewish all-day schools like Wise's in Albany, at least in the 19th century, well, they didn't seem to attract many American Jewish parents. 19th century American Jews were somewhat apathetic towards intensive Jewish learning. They wanted their children to attend the free public schools and reap the benefits of an American education. And all this threatened the stability of more traditional male-centered models of Jewish learning. Nevertheless, it seemed incredible to men like Wise that parents would reject schools with educators like him, who were trained in the classical languages and literatures of Jewish religious tradition, in favor of Sunday school classes taught by women who, by their own admission, brought little Jewish educational training to their work. So, despite the opposition of these high-profile rabbis, however, it's clear that by the 1880s, Sunday schools had become the dominant model for Jewish education in America. The Union of American Hebrew Congregations, which is the umbrella organization of the American Jewish Reform movement, they fielded a survey of Jewish religious education in 1875 that identified that there were 70 Sunday schools in different communities across the country. They fielded a second survey in 1889 and found that that number had grown to at least 200. Now, some schools were known as Sunday schools, and others were known as Sabbath schools. Now, this typically indicated, if a school was called a Sabbath school, it typically indicated that the school would meet not only on Sundays, but also on Saturday afternoons as well. Some also added a session during the week, such as at Detroit's Temple Beth El. So here on the screen is an image of its building where it met from 1867 to 1903. And at Beth El's School of Religious Instruction, which it founded in 1869, attendance was expected for 2 hours on Saturdays, 2 hours on Sundays, and also for an hour on Wednesday afternoons. But they quickly realized that this was an overly ambitious curriculum, and the Wednesday afternoon classes lasted for just 2 years. The board decided in 1871 that the Wednesday sessions must, quote, regretfully be discontinued on account of consistent lack of attendance by the students. And so the school accordingly changed its name from School of Religious Instruction to Sabbath School. Now, women were the pioneers of the American Jewish Sunday School, but by the second half of the 19th century, schools that were founded under the auspices of an established congregation, like the school at Beth El in Detroit, well, they would typically be founded under the administrative control of men. Women would continue to play important roles as volunteers in these Sunday schools in the classrooms throughout the 19th century, but rarely in these cases did they lead the schools anymore. They also had relatively little control over what they could teach. And that's because in congregational Sunday schools, control of the curriculum was typically retained by male rabbis or by congregational education boards rather than by volunteer teachers. So on the screen here is Rebecca Gratz, who would become a really important Jewish female activist in the early 20th century. And as a girl, she taught Sunday school at a San Francisco synagogue, Ohabei Shalom. That was the congregation that her father served as rabbi. Now, one day, instead of teaching catechism, which was the textbook that was mandated by the congregation's school board, she decided she wanted to teach about heroic characters from the Bible. But when the chairman of the school board paid a surprise visit to her classroom and found her teaching the story of Ruth, she was dismissed from her position, and her father was called in to the board to account for his neglect of the school. I want to draw attention here to the fact that Rebecca Gratz was censured by the Ohabei Shalom board for her failure to teach the appointed catechism. If you're familiar with catechisms, you probably think of them as Christian, specifically Catholic religious texts. But in the 19th century, Jews in both Europe and in America wrote Jewish catechisms in really enormous numbers. And catechisms were the most popular textbooks that were used in American Jewish Sunday schools during the 19th century. Now, catechisms were succinct primers of Jewish doctrine and religious thought, and they were designed to provide a really comprehensive introduction to Jewish education, to Jewish topics. And catechisms were written almost exclusively by men. Catechism was typically taught to the older grades of a Sunday school, to classes preparing for confirmation, and those classes were taught often by the congregational rabbi. Now, confirmation was a new coming of age ceremony that was adopted in most American Jewish Sunday schools to replace the bar mitzvah during this period. So congregation functioned as a graduation ceremony of sorts from the Sunday school. And it was a ceremony in which boys and girls could participate in, because historically, of course, bar mitzvah had been limited to boys alone. The idea of a bat mitzvah, of a parallel ceremony for girls, wouldn't be introduced until the 20th century. Now, because the confirmation class was typically taught by the rabbi, the confirmation really centered the rabbi as the Sunday school educator. So at their confirmation ceremonies, children were examined on their catechisms, and they were typically asked to recite verbatim what they had learned from memorizing those texts. Now, the rabbi would take very much center stage in these proceedings. And in these ceremonies, this seemed to signify that it was under the rabbi's teaching that this new generation of children were participating in this ceremony to confirm their allegiances to Judaism. Hence the name of the ceremony, confirmation. So you can see in this photograph here on the screen that the confirmation class are seated around the rabbi. This photograph is from Oregon in 1878. And this one is from Boston a few years later in the 1920s. So in researching this book, I found hundreds of these kinds of staged confirmation pictures from 19th and early 20th century Sunday schools. But while many of them featured a rabbi or a chazan, I found no examples of Sunday school classes being photographed with any female teachers. So, although Jewish Sunday schools were initially founded by women, initially led by women, although they began as a women's initiative, by the mid 19th century, they had begun to be associated with men. Women were removed from the center of administrative leadership within the American Jewish Sunday School once these schools began to be part of congregations where a male rabbi or all-male congregational educational board would be appointed as head of the school. Now, this removal of women from administrative power, this mirrored a broader exclusion of women from positions of governance within American Jewish philanthropy in the years following the Civil War. In this period, we see the beginning of a process of professionalization of charitable efforts, and this focused power increasingly in the hands of all male executive boards. And it was assumed that in this context, women should be assisting rather than leading charitable endeavors. In the earlier years of the 19th century, women had played a much more prominently leadership role in American Jewish philanthropy. In Sunday schools, women were very rarely heads of the school anymore, but they continued to be involved as classroom teachers, especially for younger grades. Now, this organization very much mirrored the gender-oriented hierarchy in American public schools, where women were predominantly employed as teachers of elementary grades, but not often as superintendents. Now, as teachers, women played really important roles in Jewish Sunday schools throughout the 19th century. But their contributions have mostly been overlooked by historians of American Judaism. They haven't written very favorably about the work of these women at all. And I think that's in part because the work that these women undertook is the kind of work that still very rarely makes headline news today. It's the work of showing up. It's the work of volunteering and working with children. But it's also because most historians have assumed that these schools didn't offer much that was very much educationally valuable. Now, in conducting the research for this book, I found that this conclusion was, to say the least, rather simplistic. So yes, these women had little Jewish education of their own, but what made these women really valuable as Sunday school teachers was that many of them spent their weekdays working as teachers in the public schools. And they had gone to normal schools, which were colleges for teacher training. Women virtually took over the field of teaching in the US during the second half of the 19th century, and Jewish women were very well represented among them. So the Jewish Sunday School came of age as the field of teacher preparation in general American education was beginning to take shape, with the founding of normal schools and teacher training colleges across the East Coast and the Midwest during the 1850s and 60s. So Jewish women who were interested in a career in teaching, well, they could cut their teeth in the Sunday school, and some continued to serve as Sunday school teachers alongside their weekday responsibilities in the public schools. And so, based on the standards of the time, these women had really great insights into pedagogy. They knew how to control a classroom. They knew how to help students learn. And if you've ever taught, you know that these are serious skills and it takes a lot to master them. And they were recognized as being valuable at the time too. So let's go back to Beth El in Detroit. In 1892, 4 out of the 5 female teachers who taught in the Congregational Sabbath School were also teachers in the local public schools. And in his annual report for 1892, the Sunday school superintendent wrote that these women bring to their classroom experience in discipline and management of pupils to such a degree that our Sabbath school is a pattern of orderly conduct, considering the crowded state of some of these rooms. Now, remember that in 1892, many of these children would also have been new immigrants still learning English. It wasn't just that the rooms were crowded, there was incredible diversity among the student body. So these women were doing incredibly skilled work to manage these classrooms. Now, it was this sense that women had real educational expertise, real pedagogical expertise. It led women to advocate for new roles and new recognition in American Jewish education at the turn of the century. Only when we realized that men had taken over the organizational leadership of American Jewish Sunday schools can we make sense of the fact that new activist organizations for Jewish women began to emerge at the end of the 19th century that made it their mission to advocate for women to have more of a voice in Jewish education. So some of you might be familiar with a Jewish women's organization called the National Council of Jewish Women, and it still exists as an advocacy organization today that's concerned with a wide variety of Jewish women's issues. But when it was founded in 1893, the founders agreed that the first priority of this new organization should be to advocate for women to be included on congregational school boards and have a voice in school administration. It was the takeover of Jewish education by men that laid the grounds for organizations like the NCJW to take on activist roles in Jewish education at the turn of the 20th century. And here too, they replicated models that were pioneered by Christian women who had for some years taken on activist roles in various social reform efforts. American Jewish women got started later than their Christian counterparts, but once they got going, these women proved themselves to really excel at the task. So in 1891, Congregation Beth El in Detroit organized a congregational women's club to provide continuing education for the women of the congregation and also to organize women's philanthropy. By the early 1900s, the club had been so successful that they had taken over the Congregational Sunday School. They had established free libraries for the Factory of Detroit and had also organized penny lunches for the children of 2 city public schools. To meet the needs of more than 2 million new Jewish immigrants who arrived from Eastern Europe and Russia between 1881 to 1924, Jewish women's organizations like the Beth El Women's Club not only created new congregational Sunday schools, they also created kindergartens and mission schools that were located in immigrant neighborhoods. They provided these children not only with Jewish education, but also with basic needs like hot baths and medicine, food, and lessons in English. Again, women here were paving new ground and founding new educational institutions to meet the needs of a new generation of immigrants. Decades after Rebecca Gratz had founded the first Hebrew Sunday School in Philadelphia for the children of new arrivals from Western Europe. But the work of these women has largely been overlooked in American Jewish history, and that's largely because of what happens next. The new immigrants who arrived in America from Eastern Europe between 1881 to 1924 brought with them a really diverse array of educational institutions that reflected their many different cultural and religious ideologies. And in 1910, concerned philanthropists created a central agency to establish order out of this chaos. The ultimate aim was to revolutionize Jewish education in America writ large. It was led by Samson Benderly. He was an enthusiastic young educator from Svat in Palestine, and he had founded an innovative community model for Jewish schooling in Baltimore that infused spoken Hebrew into the curriculum. Now, Benderly and his proteges at this bureau imagined themselves as bringing about a Jewish national and cultural renaissance by transforming Hebrew Sunday school into Hebrew school. They rejected the Sunday school's elementary Jewish curriculum and they advocated for a more intensive multi-day model that placed a primary on Hebrew language instruction. They wanted to induct children into a Jewish cultural world and not just, as the Sunday schools had done, into a set of religious ideas. Now, Benderly famously described the Sunday school as a Shanda school, a disgrace school, and he said that its graduates were, quote, otherwise intelligent men who know nothing of Judaism. Benderly was unambiguous about his hostility for Jewish Sunday schools for reasons that were pragmatic as well as ideological. Benderly and his colleagues wanted to secure the support of more traditional Jewish educators, teachers of Cheders and Talmud Torahs, and to do that, they had to convince them that they had no intention of transforming Jewish education into Sunday school education. So Benderly heaped derision on the Sunday school in order to reassure these more traditionalist colleagues that the vision for Jewish education that he had in mind was aligned with theirs. It's very unlikely, however, that Benderly could have anticipated that even more traditionally inclined American Jews would ultimately embrace the weekend model of Jewish learning that was promoted by Sunday schools in the context of post-war suburbia. Barely 2 decades after Benderly's death, Jews began moving to the newly developed suburbs, leaving behind the dense Jewish enclaves of downtown. So the model for Jewish schooling that triumphed in the Jewish suburbs during the second half of the 20th century was ironically resembled much more closely the Sunday school model than the one that Benderly had in mind. It was a part-time Jewish education conducted under the auspices of congregational synagogues. And so today, despite considerable ambivalence among teachers and parents, and not least among students themselves, the model that was pioneered by the 19th century Jewish Sunday school is still very much in evidence. Among non-Orthodox American Jewish parents, non-Orthodox Jewish parents opt overwhelmingly for supplementary schooling over all-day Jewish schools, in schools that meet at the weekend and maybe once or twice during the week as well. And women still dominate the field of supplemental Jewish education as teachers and today, of course, as education directors too. To my mind, then, it is well timed that we remember the work of the women who pioneered this field. These women worked to dismantle stereotypes of what women could know and what women could be in order to ensure that every child could affordably access at least a basic Jewish education. Thank you so much, and I look forward to answering a few of your questions.
Thank you so much, Laura, for that really excellent presentation, and also for bringing these women's stories back into the historical narrative. It was so interesting to see where all of this kind of got started. So I'll start with an easy question. And for those of you who are watching, feel free to continue sending in questions as well. What is a penny lunch? I think you mentioned.
That's a lunch that cost a penny. That was very easily that was very easily affordable for children. Wouldn't it be nice if you could get a similarly accessible, affordable lunch today?
Thank you so much. So when you you mentioned initially when for some of the earliest Sunday schools, I think for the first two that you talked about, the two women who started it were communicating with each other, and one of them was writing lessons for the other. Was this common? Were many of these women in the early stages communicating with each other about these schools?
Yes, very much so. And you have to remember that beginning of the 19th century, the American Jewish community is small, right?
Mhm.
And amongst the women who had the time and to do this kind of volunteer work, this is mostly affluent, right, American-born Sephardi women. Well, they typically knew each other, right? Families tended to be connected to one another through marriage. Women traveled from various cities. And so we have accounts of women founding Sunday schools in their home communities because they, say, traveled to Philadelphia, got the chance to see Rebecca Gratz's school in action, and thought to themselves, "Wow, this would be great. This would be great for my home community as well." In one account that I mentioned in the book, is one account of a woman who visits her sister who had married somebody living in a less settled Jewish community, a place with a smaller number of Jews. There were no educational institutions there, and so she decided, well, she had to stay and she had to set up a Sunday school. So this network of women who were connected through friendships, through marriage, through travel, are really instrumental to the founding of Jewish education in America.
That's amazing. Thank you. So you showed another question that came in, I think is coming from the fact that you showed images from Oregon to Boston, kind of all over the place. Did you notice any regional differences in any of these schools when you were studying them, or were they all kind of based on a similar model?
So I didn't notice any regional differences in terms of the sort of framework for Jewish education, but most schools use very much localized resources.
Hmm.
So I talked a fair bit about catechisms, right? Which always raises an eyebrow whenever I talk about these schools because people aren't used to Jews studying from catechisms, but they were very, very common in this period. And and catechism sort of began. Ended up developing a mass publishing market in U.S. Judaism, but they began by being written for local schools by their teachers or rabbis or chazans who taught in the classroom. And so schools could get very competitive with each other about which catechism they used and why their educator's catechism was better than another educator's catechism. One of the primary sources for this book came from the 19th century American Jewish press, from Jewish newspapers. And Jewish newspapers are really fascinating sources because they not only report on what is happening, but they also function as sort of gossip columns and opinion pages as well. And so one of the things that you really see when people write about Jewish education and when they write about local schools is a real sense of competition, right? The sense that our school is more fabulous, is has a confirmation ceremony that is more decorative and more well attended than yours. And so you do start to see, as you sort of read these kinds of columns year after year, a real sense of regional pride developing, right? This sense that within these very regional local institutions, this was the best of, say, Charleston Jury or Jury in Boston, right? This was the real kind of the fruits of the flourishing of this community could be seen in the fact that these schools were teaching, large numbers of children and graduating children from these wonderfully lavish confirmation ceremonies. So they really take on this really interesting regional character.
Thank you. And so as you just mentioned confirmation, so another question that we had come in is so you talked about how confirmations were for both boys and girls, but were bar mitzvahs still being performed when there were confirmation ceremonies, and did they, or were they kind of replaced by these confirmation ceremonies?
Yes, the answer is yes and yes.
Mhm.
And it depended on the context. So today, many synagogues still have confirmation ceremonies, but typically it is an addition, right, to bar bat or bar mitzvah. Confirmation might happen later on. Often having confirmation a few years after bar bat or bar mitzvah is an incentive to keep children in the school for a little bit longer, right, and to have a sort of graduation ceremony later into the teenage years. So in the 19th century, confirmation was imagined. It was at first imagined by German Jews, actually, and it was imported to the US. It was imagined as both as an additional ceremony as well as a replacement. And
Mhm,
this kind of split along denominational lines. So
mhm,
within reform context, reform constitutions, because confirmation had been imagined within the context of the German Reform movement. They saw this as an opportunity to do something new, to dispense with the bar mitzvah, and to have a ceremony that was both open to boys and girls, but also didn't have that same emphasis on coming of age as accepting Jewish law, right? Because of course the reform movement really sort of reimagined the role of Jewish law or halakha within the practice of Judaism. So it was a ceremony that wasn't only about gender equality, it also served that more kind of ideological ends. For other communities, more traditionalist communities, they would run confirmation in addition to having bar mitzvah ceremonies for boys. And so confirmation was this sort of additional ceremony. It was something that boys and girls could do together. Sometimes it was like a couple of years. It was a couple of years later. It sort of differed, at what age, according to context. Um, it would be held. And then in some congregations, you see quite a bit of tension between synagogue officials and the parents. So I said that in many Reform communities, confirmation was instituted as an alternative to the bar mitzvah. But you see in some communities, and particularly in New York, actually, records of congregational minutes saying, well, we we want to have confirmation as our standard ceremony, but the parents are still really wanting to have bar mitzvahs as well, right? Because they have this kind of sentimental attachment to the traditional ceremony. And so you had these sort of power dynamics too between parents who said, no, 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 we want this to be complementary, and rabbis often who were saying, no, 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 we want to move in this more kind of ideological direction of having confirmation focused on this sort of different idea of Judaism, not connected to the idea of accepting Jewish law, but of confirming our commitments to Judaism as a religious tradition.
thank you. So I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. But you talked about how women were pushed out of leadership. Did did women try to fight this at all? And if so, in what ways did they do that?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, they did, but it wasn't until later. It wasn't until the end of the 19th century.
Mhm,
And it was primarily through these activist organizations. I mentioned the National Council of Jewish Women, different congregational sisterhood chapters. This is the period in American Jewish life where women's organizations, right, that start to flourish.
mhm,
They're founded and start to flourish. And they're really founded around women doing sort of activist work, often directed at trying to assist the new immigrants who, of course, were flooding into American Jewish cities who needed a lot of support. And again, just like for Rebecca Gratz, kind of adopting that model of Christian religious education for the first Sunday school, these activist organizations were very much founded on similar activist organizations that were being founded by Christian women. And these activist organizations were directed at a whole range of different kind of social reform efforts. And so Jewish women are very much kind of following suit. And so the National Council of Jewish Women, which today really advocates on a range of issues, it's really, really interesting that when they're founded in 1893, they say that, you know, the thing that they most want to first set around changing is to get women representation on educational school boards, because women are teaching in the classroom, but their voice isn't being heard at the administrative level.
Thank you. And so I know we are at time, but I do just want to make sure I ask this before we go. We've had a lot of people ask sort of about their kind of local area, their local school. Um, if people want to maybe do research on the history of their kind of community, do you have any advice on how to maybe start doing that?
Absolutely. So the challenge of 19th century American Jewish history, of course, is that there are fewer sources than we find in later years, but there are a number of places that you can start. You can start by finding out whether you have a regional Jewish newspaper that goes back to the 19th century, and of course, this is most helpful for folks who are living in larger urban contexts. But they're a really, really great resource for American Jewish education history. Of course, I also recommend looking at your local Jewish Historical Society if you have one. And then there are some national institutions as well, like the American Jewish Archives in Cincinnati and the Center for Jewish History in New York, and other museums in New York. I use the New York Public Library quite a lot in my research for this book. So these sources can be a little bit scattered far and wide. You might also begin by seeing if there's a mention of your local Sunday school in my book, because I tried to include everything that I could find.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for answering all these questions, for giving us all this really amazing information, for that really excellent presentation. It was really a pleasure to have you here, Laura. So thank you so much.
Thank you to
Of
everyone. Thank you for being here, and thank you for the invitation.
course, yeah. And I highly encourage all of you who are watching today to purchase Jewish Sunday Schools, which you can do at the link in the chat. If you enjoyed today's program, we do hope you'll consider making a donation to support the museum at mjhnyc.org/support and joining us for our upcoming programs, which you can find at mjhnyc.org/current events.